that's then what excited me, is I really wanted to build something where like I fundamentally believe in the mission, and I fundamentally am excited about the product.
In this episode, I'm joined by Max Rofagha. Max is the founder of Finimize, the UK startup making finance accessible for millennials. Before Finimize, Max co-founded an e-commerce startup with 200 employees and sold it in 2015. He also mentors at Techstars and Startup Bootcamp and was named one of Forbes 30 under 30s for 2016. In this episode, Max describes how his early exposure to the internet fostered his creative spirit that ultimately led to him to establish what became Switzerland's second largest e-commerce business. He shares his challenges in scaling this business and the process he went through to exit. Max discusses how a clear focus on mission and purpose led him to establish the Finimize platform, and how the drafting and publishing of the company's culture manifesto gave it a clear direction. He shares about how his business has been able to provide valuable information via a connected community to its users, and the different approach he's adopted to disrupt the financial advisory market.
Welcome to The Little Black Book, a podcast for entrepreneurs by entrepreneurs who provide their first-hand experiences to help others learn and grow. This podcast is brought to you by Altitude Advisory. Altitude Advisory is a modern business advisory firm helping business owners build a better business for a better life.
Mate, favourite movie of all time?
I thought a lot about this question, and I probably have to gonna go with The Gladiator.
Yeah.
With, I guess, Russell Crowe.
Yeah.
I believe is Australian. So
New Zealand.
Maybe that.
We try and claim him.
It's one of those movies that you can just watch over and over again, just because it's such an epic story. It's not like I watch it every single night, but I'll watch it maybe once, maybe twice a year. I think the soundtrack's phenomenal. I think the story is incredible. And it's just one of those really epic movies.
Yeah. No, that's really cool. It's interesting. Yeah, probably topical. I was just reading the news today, and Russell Crowe's actually in Adelaide visiting at the minute, and he was featured in our local news, and the images of him, and mate, if you get online and have a look at the search, Russell Crowe, what he looks like now versus what he looked like in...
Yeah, he's gotten big.
He is real big. So he is real big. So, no, cool. What about a book, mate, that as a child or a young adult had a real impact on you, and why?
So there's one book that I really like called The Little Prince.
Right.
From this French author called Saint-Exupéry.
Yeah.
And the reason why I really like it is it's the story of this little boy who lives in this sort of made up universe and is exploring the world and is exploring these different planets, etc. And everything that he comes across has a deeper meaning and has a deeper life lesson. And it's one of those books where you read it as a kid, and it's a really nice story, and you just take it as a shallow story. And then I read it again when I was a teenager in French class in the original, and we really took a deep dive into understanding what was the commentary here.
Yeah.
Because it was written by a Frenchman who had experienced a whole lot of things, from wars to sort of traveling around the world, etc. And it just struck me as one of those books where you can just read it over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And you'll have a completely different interpretation every time you read it.
Yeah.
And the reason why I think it's cool is because it just really draws out and highlights what are the key things that you need to focus on in life. Especially, I think, in business, you can get very hung up on the quarterly KPIs or something like that, and you might lose some sleep over those. But you really zoom out and you understand, well, there's more to life than just that. And I think this book does a really, really phenomenal job at communicating this in a very creative way.
Yeah, that's really cool. And it's interesting, some of your background, I think you were originally born in Berlin, is that right, or in Germany?
Yes.
And then you studied in London. You had business in Denmark, and I know we've been talking today. Switzerland, and you've been a bit everywhere. So it's a bit of parallels, perhaps, with you, mate, with this story, with the off exploring the world and different planets and stuff like that. I guess in your evolution
maybe
as well.
That's why I like it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think his stories are probably more interesting than mine, but yeah, definitely this adventure spirit, I think, is really cool.
Yeah, cool. So mate, just if you can, just share a bit of your background, because I reckon it's I've heard your story a little bit before, but neat how you've sort of evolved and then originally got into business. Do you want to just maybe share some of that with us?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you said, I'm originally from Berlin. I went to a German-American high school. That's why I have this slightly strange accent. And the reason is that if you remember, sort of small history tangent, Berlin used to be broken up into different sectors, and I grew up in the area where the Americans had their little sector. Yeah, and so that's why I am part of the generation that experienced life before the World Wide Web. Yeah, I'm the last generation that experienced life before the World Wide Web. I can still remember what it was like not having a smartphone, not having internet at your house, etc. And I very, very vividly remember the day that we got dial up at my house. Yeah. And I remember exploring the internet, and it was just absolutely fascinating to me. Yeah. And I started dabbling and tinkering in that space, and I started building my own websites and sort of getting into Flash. That was like the hot thing back then. And you had like all these Flash websites that were completely animated. And I ended up having this website where I took a book that I owned, which just had a list of Bart Simpson jokes. Yeah. And I typed them up and published them on my website. And that was my website. Yeah. And I was then, I think, one of the first kids in my school to have a website. And then so that's always been this like fascination that I've had with the online space, because it was really cool. You know, you could just, I would just sit in my parents' house and I would do something on my computer, and then I would publish it, and then all of a sudden it's like all over the world. It's everywhere. You know, like everybody could access it. Yeah. And you could just like produce something in a very quick and iterative manner, and that just got me hooked. And then I studied economics and international relations, and I went to school in Scotland, actually. What happens at university is you go to these careers fairs, and all these large corporations come in there, and they tell you, hey, you know, you should really become a banker, or you should really become a consultant or a lawyer, or whatever it is. And so I've explored a couple of these routes and did some internships here and there just to sort of see what it's all about. And drank the Kool-Aid for a little bit. Yeah. And then in my final year, I did an internship at eBay. And which kind of very randomly just happened. And although it was a huge corporation at that time, I rediscovered this passion that I had for digital products. And I saw, like, we would discuss certain elements of the website. And I saw how quickly like people could change stuff, and you could like run different tests, etc. And I was like, wow, this is like, you know, having now explored banks and consulting and whatever, like this is actually really what I do still care about. Yeah. And then ended up working for 1 year in London. That was the only year in my life that I actually had a real job, for a consulting firm that was focused on media, telco, sports, like that kind of sector space. And what was interesting is I found myself having a very natural entrepreneurial itch, so to speak, because I went up to my boss one day and I said, hey, you you seem to be bringing in quite a few deals here in this partnership. Like, should we not just spin off and we do our own consulting business, and you bring in the deals and I do the analyst work? And we would like meet in a cafe to like discuss this in secrecy. Ultimately, I realized, you know what, actually, I don't have a passion for any of this consulting stuff. Yeah. But I got really excited by the idea of having my own company as well. And then I've been exploring a couple of projects with some friends, and then ended up actually doing one of them, which brought me to Zurich in Switzerland. And we built an e-commerce business. We did that for like 5 years, grew that into the largest e-commerce business after Amazon within the country. Switzerland. And then we sold it to the largest media house. And that's when I started Finimize after.
If we can, the e-com thing is quite fascinating because you build it to a really, I guess, significant scale in a really short period of time. What was some of your learnings as an entrepreneur? You obviously had a couple of business partners and so forth in there. What were some of your learnings in terms of, scaling that business up and then obviously getting it ready for sale and then exiting for the benefit of our listeners?
So we grew really, really quickly initially because we had one of those daily deal sites that were the hot thing, if you remember.
Yeah.
And it was one of those, I think Groupon was the fastest growing business ever in the history of businesses. And you started seeing sort of different models pop up in every country.
Yeah.
We were one of them. And that thing just like grew very, very quickly.
Yeah.
And then we moved it away because we realized there's a bit of a ceiling here, and some of the economics of that model, as we later also saw with Groupon, don't really stack up.
Yeah.
And made a pretty aggressive move to pivot away from pure deals and coupons towards e-commerce.
Yeah.
Actually owning inventory.
Yeah.
Having a warehouse. All the hard stuff.
Yeah.
And we did that for multiple categories. So you could in the end, you could buy pretty much anything you wanted with us. But our key USP was it was always at a discount. And so we had this like large user base that I would say was largely driven by this daily deal stuff that allowed us to then iterate and try out new verticals. And so I think the amazing thing was like, once you have scale, you can really just try out so many different things.
Yeah.
Like we would try out a certain vertical, like, I don't know, let's just say wine and spirits.
Yeah.
And we would say, hey, like this works or this doesn't work. If it doesn't work, we'd shut it down and we'd start the next thing.
Yeah.
So like, I think the scale was really important. And then to come to your question around like selling it, ultimately we got it to a point where we were doing a lot of revenue, and we also underwent this whole process of cutting costs, ultimately got it to a point of sort of break-even profitability. And then it starts becoming a thing of how can you drive up profits? Because the issue that we had a little bit was we were based out of Switzerland. And so how could you expand from there? Well, really the only way that you could expand is by going international.
Yeah.
But that becomes really difficult because Switzerland has like the highest cost base in all of Europe. Yeah. So it would be really difficult to compete with other companies throughout the country, throughout the continent.
Yeah.
And so then it became a question of, okay, how can we make this more profitable? And I think that's when we realized, maybe this is a really good time to now hand this over. It's in a profitable state. It's a solid business. It's still running, and maybe someone else can now sort of take it through the next chapter.
Yeah,
and that's what ended up happening.
Yeah, cool. Was there any particular learnings of the sales process that you went through in terms of exiting the business that were challenging for you, or really positive experiences in terms of due diligence or dealing with much larger company coming to take you over and things like that? What was that like?
So we had a few folks who we were speaking to. We were speaking to some private equity firms. We were speaking to some Americans. I think ultimately what was important for us is how they think about it, how it fits into their strategy. Like, will it remain an independent business? I think what happened really nicely was that we ended up actually merging with another business right before we sold it.
Yeah.
As a result, it became clear this is going to become a growth strategy rather than they're going to buy it and they're going to cut it down.
Yeah.
And so as a result, like nobody lost their job, etc. So that was really important. And then I think one of the lessons was just how important it is to over communicate. That's also one of the mantras that we have now. It's like, Just really, really make sure that everybody in the company understands what's happening, why is it happening, who are these new people, what are they going to do, what's their intention. They need to show their face. Like it's at the end of the day, it's a very human process.
No, that's cool. And post that, you've then gone and set up Finimize, which is your current business. Now, Finimize is all about, I suppose, making financial information available to everyday investors. Talk to me how the real clear, definition or distinction between the two, and how you ended up on a very different path now with this advice model and platform and education platform, if you like, versus the pure trading e-com. We're selling this, we're going to maximize our profit, and very, very cut and dry.
Yeah, I think that was part of the reason why I wanted to do something else. So I think a couple of points. Number one, I think e-commerce was an incredible learning ground, because the business model is established. You don't have to find product market fit when it comes to the business model. It's quite operationally heavy. And so it was an amazing learning ground. But what it lacked, I would say, was, in my experience, there's few people who wake up and are driven by a larger mission of what they're trying to achieve. Because ultimately you're selling a product. It's a very transactional business. And for me, what was important was, for the next business that I wanted to do, I wanted to make sure that it's very product driven. And it's very mission driven. We, 2, 3, 4 years in, we started this whole process of really defining what is our mission, what is our core purpose, what do we stand for, etc. And it was a pretty long process, because we had to involve a lot of people, and because at that time we were quite a large company already. And I just knew, for the next company, that I just wanted to have all of that really clear from the start. And so the first thing that I did is I wrote our culture manifest, which is also public. You can go to finimize.com/culture. And I just wrote down, here's our mission, here's how we go about things, here are our mantras. And I think that's then what excited me, is I really wanted to build something where I fundamentally believe in the mission, and I fundamentally am excited about the product. And then the other thing is, I started the company because I had a very personal connection with the problem. So in a very, very quick recap, what happened was I had built up savings by putting money aside from my salary every month. And I woke up one day and I looked at my savings account and I noticed that I'd built up savings, which was great news. But it was unclear to me what I should do with these savings. And I found it really difficult to wrap my head around it. And I found that when I went to go see a financial advisor, they were basically salespeople trying to sell me their products. That was this frustration that I had experienced that led me to start Finimize. So it was a combination of wanting to do something very product driven, wanting to do something that has a personal connection that then will allow me to really build this mission driven organization. And maybe as a final point, I think that's one of the things that I've learned in life is how difficult it becomes to plan. I never ever imagined myself getting into retail. I remember actually being in university and thinking, there's one category that I don't want to get into, is retail, because I find it kind of boring, to be honest. But I ended up in retail and I actually really enjoyed it. And then I never thought I would get into finance and media, etc. And here I am doing that. And so I try to go with the flow a little bit. But that's in a nutshell how all of this came about. So
the model for Finimize is largely, I'll call it, about disrupting traditional financial services advice. It's about making it accessible, making it easy to get, making it easy to understand, as opposed to necessarily having to go and see a financial advisor and them, as you had your experience, have them ram financial product down your throat and say, here buy this, that, and something else from you. So
How are you finding that disruption? How are you finding the traction and the take up in and I've heard you refer to it as a community, in the Finimize community and your followers and your subscribers?
The best way to answer that question is to really think about the market landscape, because I think it's being highlighted very, very recently with this whole retail investor search, what the need for our product is. And so if you think about it, there's never been more retail investors entering the market than today. In the US alone, which is, I have the stat for, 10 million investors entered the market last year.
Yeah.
That's 10% growth versus the previous year. The last time there was a 10% growth, it took 6 years, not one.
Yeah.
This year, things are accelerating even more. Charles Schwab, a large US broker, just announced that Q1 results. They said they added more users in Q1 of this year than they added all of last year. So there's a massive acceleration happening.
Yeah.
It's awesome. And people talk about democratizing financial markets. But what you realize is, or what you have to realize is that the infrastructure, the tools, the platforms, they are just one part of the ecosystem. And so innovations like fractional share, like zero commission trading, they've lowered the barriers to entry. And that's what's allowed all these retail investors to flood into the market.
Yep.
But it's created a vacuum. And that vacuum is, there's no high quality investing insights and no modern financial information platform that exists. There are a lot of existing platforms. They are A, super old school, and B, prohibitively expensive. And that has then created this vacuum that's now trying to be filled by free platforms. And you're starting to see the rise of these pseudo finance gurus on TikTok, where people, in the US, for example, they take their stimulus check and they're now giving investing advice. and obviously you have the rise of Reddit, etc. And I think there's a lot of interesting things out there on these free platforms, but I think there's also a lot of noise and a lot of junk. And where we really see ourselves fit in is filling that vacuum and essentially complementing this democratization of financial markets, where you have the platforms, you have the brokerages, etc., but you still need that modern financial information platform and community that we are building. And so the way that we think about what we're doing is we're really building the tools and the information for the modern retail investor who's mobile first, who's time poor, who's community driven, who learns by doing, and who also looks at different asset classes than perhaps their parents did. And that's really where we fit into the ecosystem, and that's the ethos that we try to embrace. Yeah.
So it's not so much for you guys about then providing the platform to trade or do anything like that. It's about providing the front end advice or information so that people can go and find their own platform, execute their own trades in line with the information that they learn from reading the material and so forth on your site.
Exactly. So we really see there's three parts to an investment journey. There's a discovery part where people identify interesting investing ideas and they do that with us. Then there's a research part where people go off and they try and validate those ideas or disprove those ideas. And then there's an execution part where they then go off and they make a trade. We have this fundamental belief that in the long run, the execution piece is going to become a commodity.
Yeah.
And so we believe that the most value actually can be created in the discovery and research phase of the journey. And execution at the end of the day, when we speak to our users, they have very little loyalty. At the end of the day, it's whoever can give me the best price. And the best price happens to be zero.
Yeah.
That's how we kind of view the market and where the value can be captured.
Yeah. And I suppose with your model too, then, in some of those insights and information that you provide, I suppose you're very guarded about from a compliance or a regulatory process not to be providing specific advice at the same time.
Exactly. So I think that's also one of the tenets of our proposition is we never say buy, sell, hold, or whatever people would think about when they think about advice. What we do is, at the end of the day, people are smart, and what we need to do is give them all the information so that they can make a smart decision.
Yeah.
And if that smart decision ends up being doing nothing, we're also completely fine with that.
Yeah.
But you've made that decision because you're informed, not because you're uninformed.
You could be giving information on cyber currencies as much as you could be on stocks and bonds and property markets. So, have you got experts then that contribute in all those areas, or how do your team, I guess, function and collate all that useful information for people?
Yeah. So the way that we work is we have a team of analysts. They tend to come from top tier financial institutions like Goldman Sachs, Fidelity, etc.
Yeah.
And they bring a whole range of experiences that they can then share the insights with our audience. And everything that we produce is in-house. We try to look at all the different asset classes that people care about. One of the ways that we try to produce content is to be very, very community informed.
Yeah.
And so if our community cares about cryptocurrencies, then we will talk about them. And if our community cares about the property market or certain geographies or certain stocks, then we will talk about that. And we have the expertise in-house that is deep, but also broad enough from the different people that we've gotten on board.
Yeah, cool. So with your team then and having all that in-house expertise, where are all the team members located? I presume they're located from wherever. They're not all sitting in a single office or anything like that.
Well, we used to before COVID. We used to pretty much. We had a few people not in London, but we used to have most people sitting in our sort of headquarter in London. Yeah. But I would say the majority of the people are in that area.
Yeah, okay.
We do have some folks in the US and some folks throughout continental Europe.
It's interesting, and I've read your culture manifest and so forth on the website, and with your expanding team of different people. One of your mantras there is to eat your own dog food, which I think is the first one on the list. Which I mean, okay, what does this mean? I had to read this through a couple of times, but basically the framework around that was about creating content that's useful and meaningful for your users. So, write it so that somebody else would easily understand it. Now, how far do things like that extend in your business in terms of your information that you provide? Is there guidelines and frameworks that if somebody's writing commentary on a certain asset class, do they have to own it or experience or do they have to disclose that area? How does that all fit together from that side of things?
I think when I wrote that mantra, I meant it even more general than just content or more comprehensive rather. So content is a very big part of it, but also the way that our apps and newsletters work. And so the idea really is if you're not using our products and services, then why would we expect anybody else to use them?
Yeah.
And if that is the case, then we have this other mantra that says, see something, say something, do something.
Yeah.
And then we would expect people to say, hey, you know what, like I've kind of churned, I've dropped off using the product. And then we need to brainstorm why that is the case. And we have certain formats in-house, like we have a weekly lunch session and we try to surface these things. And, I think people need to have conviction internally that what we're doing adds value. And if it doesn't add value, then why would we expect anybody else to get value from it? And that's really what I meant by that.
The culture manifest and your mantras and stuff like that. How does that come into play in your recruiting? There's been so much stuff about business and culture and values and having clear alignment with team and so on. How do you roll that out through new team members when you're interviewing from the first time when they're coming to apply for a job from Goldman Sachs?
Yeah, so I think for us it's quite nice. On the one side, it acts a bit like a filter. So there's a certain self-selection. I think our engineering team actually went one step further and they did their own engineering culture manifest, and they wrote out, if you're like this and if you're into this, then you probably would really like it here. And if you're more like this and you're more into that, then you probably won't like it here.
Yeah.
One of the hiring philosophies that I subscribe to is hire slowly and fire fast.
Yeah.
And when we hire slowly, I think we just really want to make sure that we've found the right person.
Yeah.
And the culture manifest is an amazing compass for helping us do that.
Yeah.
And what I would add to that is, people often ask, why do people from high-powered jobs come to your little company? And I think it always comes down to the way that we think about the mission. And when I speak to new joiners, I think the majority always join us because they really, really care about what we're doing. And I think the manifest is a way for us to communicate what we're about and what we're trying to do. And so from that point of view, it's a really, really effective tool in the hiring process.
Yeah. And I know one thing that we do in our business, and we're very strong on this in what we do with our team, is that our values and our behaviors around our values, which, equivalent of your culture manifest, and then our service standards and behaviors that fit in behind that, actually form part of our employment agreements, so that we can then we can then performance manage if somebody's playing outside of that framework. Do you guys take it to that extent, or the team ultimately performance manage people out that are playing outside those guidelines anyway, so that it doesn't ever get to that extent?
Today, we don't take it to that extent. We definitely reference these things in our day-to-day conversations. You'll hear people referencing certain mantras.
Yeah.
But in order to really close the circle, I think then we also need to go into this reflection mode and say, like, hey, have we actually been living up to this?
Yeah.
Have you been living up to it? Have I been living up to it, et cetera, and make it part of the performance? I think that's the next step for us.
One of the things that I think we do really well is we actually call out those good behaviors. And so when one team member sees somebody behaving in a certain way that's in line with those values, is that they actually get called out for that in front of their team and rewarded. So it's about that positive recognition, as opposed to you're getting clipped behind the ear when you don't do it.
Yeah.
So reinforcing good behavior as opposed to bad. Mate, one of the things I've heard you describe Finimize as a real community, and a community of users and obviously your team. Tell me how that community's expanded, because community gives a sense of I'll call it socialism, if you like, around that. But ultimately, at the end of the day, you got to pay wages and you got to pay bills, and you want to make a dollar out of this as well. So how do you then connect with that community but still run the business and make money out of this at the same time?
So community, I think, is a very often misused term. I think companies often refer to themselves as having communities just because they have a Facebook page with some followers.
Yeah.
That's not how we define community. I think community really is when people create value for each other. So this peer-to-peer element. We could step back and not do anything, and the community would continue to be alive.
Yeah.
And so what happened in our case is that it was never really the grand vision to build a community, but it happened very organically, and we embraced it, and then we promoted it. So what happened was that one day we said, hey, why don't we meet some of the people who use our service? And we met up in a pub, and we were surprised that something like 50 people showed up.
Yeah.
And the pub was taken over by Finimize users. And so we said, oh, okay, that's kind of cool. Let's do this another time. And more and more people started showing up. We would have like 100, 200, 300 people. And then people started emailing us and started saying, hey, can you do this in Sydney? Can you do this in Los Angeles? Can you do this in New York, etc.? And we said, unfortunately, we can't. But as we started to think about it, we said, maybe actually you can. Why don't you host this in Sydney? Why don't you host this in Los Angeles? And that then gave life to our community, where we have these hosts. They are they're members of our community, and they apply to become a community host. And they do this on a completely voluntary basis. We don't pay them or anything. Again, they do this because they believe in our mission. And we now have hosts literally all over the world, in Australia, in Africa, in East Asia, in the US, Europe, etc. And these people organize meetups where they try and discuss topics that people really care about in their local communities. And now with COVID, obviously we went fully virtual, so it's actually broadened the scope quite a bit. But that's really how it started. And now meetups happen virtually, and that's really accelerated.
I love it.
The growth.
Yeah.
Last year we connected 30,000 people. This year we've already connected more than 20,000 people, which makes us the largest financial gathering in the world.
Wow.
By quite a distance. And that creates not only community value, that also creates business value.
Yeah.
And so community has a lot of, I think, positive business effects. Number one is it contributes to your brand equity. Number two is it can serve as a really interesting tool to create user-generated content.
Yeah.
So for example, a lot of these meetups we actually record, and then that becomes content that we put into our app.
Yeah.
And then the third piece is community drives retention. People who engage with our community are 2 times more likely to stick around than those who don't.
Yeah.
And so that hopefully answers your question around, how does it actually give us business value? There's multiple facets in which it actually drives business value.
Yeah. Mate, what are some of the obstacles that you've had to overcome, I guess, in the development of Finimize, in that journey so far?
There's not one particular one. That's like a sort of accumulation of multiples ones along the journey. Whether that was obviously like COVID was a big thing, which interestingly we actually came out stronger than we went into it. I think hiring continues to be one of those things where it's really difficult to find really, really good people.
Yeah.
And it's such a competitive market. And now as obviously we're going to go more and more into a remote world, hiring is going to become even more competitive because now all the companies are competing for your talent, not just locally. Yeah. Making sure that talent gets retained, gets developed, etc. I always really like to think about it as a sports team, and you need to constantly, if you think about like a football team, they have someone who coaches just the goalie, someone who coaches like every position, then they have a physiotherapist, like, etc. And so we try to do more and more also for personal development, personal growth. So I think that's really important. And then I think, just really at the end of the day, we're currently selling content only. Yeah. And that's a competitive space to be in. Yeah. People have been trained that content is available for free. And I think that's changing. I think, music has been the leading indicator with everything. People used to think that was completely free, and now we're all paying for Spotify or Apple Music or whatever it is that we're paying for. And I think that still has to happen in the space that we're in, where there is a customer and market education piece that's currently happening that makes it challenging sometimes to really I guess like apply the business model where people have to pay for a subscription. Yeah. But we're getting there, and it's really exciting times. It's one of those things where you have a challenge and you try to overcome it, and then you overcome it, and then the next challenge comes up. Yeah, and that's the circle of life.
I particularly agree with your comments around hiring and staff, and the world's flat now. Recruiting isn't something now, a thing that you just do when you need to. Recruiting is now something that is just a core business process that happens all the time.
You kind of always need to be recruiting, even if you're not recruiting, because you need to have that pipeline of really strong candidates. Otherwise, it's going to take ages to start it up.
Exactly right. Mate, do you have a life motto?
I think my life motto very much revolves around what I was saying earlier on, with trying to go with the flow. Yeah. And trying to to sort of reference that very famous Steve Jobs commencement speech, which perhaps people have seen, where he talks about connecting the dots in hindsight. I think I've realized for myself that's something that's happening in my life. Like I said, I never planned to get into retail, never planned to get in financial media, and here I am.
Yeah.
And I just believe that there's a connected path that when I look back, I'll be like, oh yeah, that made a lot of sense why that happened like that. And I think the interesting thing with that approach is it allows you to experience many different things.
Yeah.
And if you don't really have a set plan where you say, okay, I'm going to do this, then I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to do that, but you're kind of open-minded about where life takes you. And I think that's how I try to lead my life.
What about a mentor? Do you have a mentor or a group of coaches or anything like that you catch up with at a personal or business level?
I do a lot of exchange with other founders. What I always found really useful is founders who perhaps are a couple of steps ahead of us, but not light years.
Yeah.
So that there's still very applicable learnings that we can take on board. But I also take people, we have people in our investor setup and on our board, etc., who are light years ahead of us.
Yeah.
And that's also just interesting to learn from on a larger scale sort of strategy piece and thinking piece. So I'm very much a believer in just sort of building out a network and then having specific people that you turn to with specific questions.
Mate, where can people find you?
You can find me personally on Twitter. Just type in my name, Max Rofagha, or my handle is Whole Earth Web.
Yep.
And you can sign up to Finimize, finimize.com. You can sign up for our newsletter for free, and you can download our apps in the Android and iOS store and check out what we're up to there.
Mate, it's been a lot of fun. Thanks very much for joining me.
Thank you. Hey everybody, I'm Max Rofagha. I'm the founder and CEO of Finimize, and thanks for joining us on the Little Black Book.